Alright, today we're going to look at the skin, do an overview of the skin, and then get into some detail. Finishing histology and starting the first of many organ systems, you'll notice that the skin is an organ. Organs, again, are made of two or more layers, two or more tissues. In this figure, you'll notice there are actually several types of tissue within skin. The skin is an organ about 9 pounds roughly. The skin is referred to as the dermis and epidermis, two layers. Epidermis, epi means on top of. The dermis is the deep layer of the skin, which is also referred to as one's hide. Within the skin, you'll notice several different structures. These structures are referred to in the textbook as appendages of skin, and that would include glands, hair, blood vessels, and nerve endings. And some of the nerve ending detail will be covered in this unit, and some we'll save for a later day when we get into the actual nervous system. To tie in nervous system terminology, you should notice the yellow structures throughout the skin. These are called nerve endings or receptors, and remember, receptors send their information to the brain via afferent nerves. Under the skin, you have a layer called the hypodermis, which is not technically part of the skin. A synonym or another name for the hypodermis is the subcutaneous layer, and that is primarily composed of adipose tissue. The epidermis is made of epithelium. You should recall that it's made of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, organized in 4 or 5 sublayers called stratum. The dermis is divided into 2 regions or 2 layers referred to as papillary and reticular, and you'll notice in this figure that the reticular layer is the primary or the major layer that contributes thickness to the total skin, or it is the thickest layer of the dermis. Okay, it is the thickest layer of all skin, but it is a dermal layer. Now in this unit we're also going to talk about the anatomy of hair and nails. You're going to need to know the structure and function of 2 different primary glands found in the skin, one referred to as the eccrine or sudoriferous sweat gland, and the other, which is located along hair follicles, referred to as sebaceous or oil-producing glands. Now, if you think about function of skin, the skin's purpose is to protect you. It protects you in many ways. Protection can come in the form of several layers of epithelial cells. You remember that the shape of the epithelial cell was flat or scale-like, and the term for that was squamous or squamous. And to offer protection, we have a stratified tissue. The youngest cells are deep at the bottom of the epidermis, a layer known as the stratum basale or germinativum. The top layer, which you see, feel, and touch, is referred to as the stratum corneum. You'll be expected to know these layers from superficial to deep or deep to superficial come test day. You'll need to review the textbook and notes to know what is the thickest layer of the epidermis, what is the thinnest layer, which layers are considered dead, dying, or alive, where does cell division occur, and you would be thinking of choices referred to as stratum. Okay, in this picture you can see that there are 4 layers. That means that this is thin skin. A thick skin, which is the palm of your hand or the plantar surface of your foot, would contain a 5th layer called stratum lucidium. Stratum lucidium is absent in thin skin. When you think of the skin and its interaction with the environment, again, it serves to protect you. It keeps out the elements. It reacts to the sun. One of the major functions of the skin is to produce vitamin D. You should know that vitamin D has a fancy name. I'd like you to look up on your own in the book or using a credible site on the internet to know the technical name for active vitamin D. The skin reacts to UV light from the sun through a process that we would call a photoreaction, responding to sunlight. The skin works together with the liver and kidneys to produce vitamin D4. So it goes through a series of biological chemical reactions. It goes from D1 to D2 to D3, and finally active vitamin D is referred to as D4 and has a fancy name. Vitamin D's purpose is that it helps you absorb calcium from your stomach and GI tract, scratch stomach, from the intestine. Okay? There are going to be cells in the stomach that are also involved that help in the absorption of vitamin D, or rather of calcium. So together your stomach and skin work together to, or your GI tract and skin work together to help you absorb calcium. In part 1, or rather chapter 1, you might remember that on page 9 you had a homeostatic negative feedback mechanism with a receptor on one end of a seesaw, afferent nerve fibers sending information to a control center, and that control center sending out a control response to an effector. And through negative feedback we regulate temperature. Either in cold situations or warm situations, there is a feedback mechanism to cool you if you get too warm and to keep you warm if you're in a cold environment. We know that shivering and sweating are negative feedback mechanisms which would relate between a relationship with the skin and nervous system. Roughly every month you shed your skin. That process is referred to as desquamation. Okay? And in one's lifetime they might shed up to 40 pounds of skin cells. Histology figure, which you should be familiar with by now with your histo experience in lab. You can see the underlying layer of the skin is referred to as the dermis, and recognize that this looks like a random pattern of swirls of collagen. Again, collagen in dense irregular connective tissue is what gives skin its strength. The top part of the skin is going to be keratinized, we said, and the cells within the skin are called keratinocytes. Would like you to know the chemistry, composition, function, and purpose of 3 substances: keratin, collagen, and skin pigment known as melanin. Again, 3 cell types: melanocytes, keratinocytes, and then in the connective tissue you're going to have fibroblasts producing collagen. Langerhans cells are immune cells that monitor antigens and awaken your immune system if you've been exposed to some threat. Now there are, again, 4 layers to thin skin, 5 layers to thick skin. The stratum basale is also known as stratum germinativum. This layer sits directly on top of the basement membrane of connective tissue that you might recall was areolar connective tissue. And you would look back into the histo chapter to be familiar with the tissues mentioned with the skin. This is the layer that undergoes mitosis and cell division. This is the layer that's considered living and actively dividing. And as these young actively dividing cells divide, they push the older cells to the surface or towards the stratum corneum. Okay? And you can see the stratum corneum is the thickest layer of the epidermis. So you're going to want to keep straight when we say thickness. Are we talking about the epidermis, dermis, or the skin as a whole? Second layer of the skin, as we work our way up to the superficial or apical surface, is called stratum spinosum, and this is going to be a layer that contains prekeratin, which appears to be spiny under a microscope. There are no spines. Stratum granulosum is the granular layer, contains roughly 5 cells. The substance here that you would want to know a little more about from your textbook reading is keratohyalin. You should understand that this area helps to waterproof us. This is an area where we begin to see cell death because the cells are being pushed away from their blood supply. You should all remember that epithelium is avascular and innervated. The word avascular means that it lacks a blood supply, but it does have nerve supply or the ability to sense one's environment. The granulosum is referred to as the strongest and toughest layer due to the keratohyaline. hyaline. And again, it is a waterproofing layer, as is the corneum. The stratum corneum is the thickest layer. It offers protection in the form of several layers of cells, and this might protect us from penetration of a splinter maybe, or abrasion when we skin our knee and elbow. Sometimes we bleed, sometimes we don't, sometimes we have pain, sometimes we don't. That would determine on how deep the injury was or the insult was to your skin. And again, if we do bleed, then you know it was deep enough that it went through the epidermis into the dermis where the blood supply is. Again, in this slide, this would be another tissue that offers waterproofing, and the waterproofing would be related to a substance here referred to as glycolipids. So this layer offers protection, physical protection, because of the number of cells. And that's thin skin. Again, if we have thick skin, between the stratum granulosum and corneum, we would find a thin layer of dead cells called stratum lucidium. And lucidium is found only in the plantar surface or sole of your foot, and the palmar surface or the anterior hand. A way to keep straight where is thin and thick skin found on your body is that thick skin does not have hair. Only thin skin is capable of producing hair or has hair within it, even if it's fine hair. Now the acid mantle, which protects the skin, is a combination of oil and sweat. And the fancy term for oil is referred to as sebum. Together, they contribute to a acidic range of the skin, and you will note that 5.4, 5.9 is close to 7, so we would say this is weakly acidic. Okay, and you should understand the pH scale from the chemistry chapter, which we covered earlier. Last point before moving away from the epidermis is to recall that the deepest layer is referred to as stratum germinativum. We have stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and if present, the stratum lucidium would lie between granulosum and corneum. At the bottom, the cells are living. Within the middle here, the cells are dying, and at the surface, the cells are dead. So living, dying, dead. If we move away from the epidermis, we look at the dermis. The dermis is referred to as the hide. And again, the dermis is made of two layers. One referred to as the papillary, which is the superficial layer of the dermis. The epidermis sits directly on top of it. Remember, there's a thin layer of areolar connective tissue or loose connective tissue, a jelly-like substance, always found between layers. The deepest layer of the dermis is referred to as the reticular layer, and this is the layer that is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. This is the thickest layer of the dermis and is also the thickest layer of the skin. And it's structurally strong due to a protein known as collagen. And the papillary layer is made of the areolar connective tissue. It's got some fancy names that you may know, referred to as the basal lamina or lamina propria, and generically known as the basement membrane. You should know that your fingerprints and the other creases and contours that you can see when you look at your own skin is due to the dermal ridges, folds, and papillae below the epidermis. The dermis is made of dense, irregular connective tissue, and this is the thickest layer of the skin. Below the skin, you have a layer referred to as the subcutaneous, also known as hypodermis, a layer that is thicker in women than in men, especially in the hips, buttocks, and thighs, and males generally carry their adipose mostly in the belly, or what I like to call the Milwaukee goiter, as in beer belly. And this is the more risky adipose tissue. It's also sometimes referred to as killer fat or visceral fat, as it is the fat or adipose that increases one's cardiovascular health risk. So cardiovascular disease is more associated with adipose packed in and around your organs than the safer location, which is, and it's a different chemistry fat as well, by the way, different chemical composition, that hypodermis. Now, terms you might think of in a different context after hearing this and completing this chapter is a needle that's been injected into your skin. If we administer a drug below the skin, that's referred to as subcutaneous, and if we're injecting it into the underlying adipose, we would call that the subcutaneous layer. So we use a hypodermic needle to inject subcutaneously. If we go deeper than the subcutaneous, we would refer to that as intramuscular. Within the skin, we said we have appendages. Appendages of the skin are going to include glands, nerves, blood vessels, hair, and nails. Okay? And the greatest priority is going to be placed on the glands, nerves, and blood vessels. You can see in the figure here two different anatomical structures of glands. The left side of the screen is the sebaceous or oil-producing gland, the product of the sebaceous gland produced by cuboidal epithelial cells or stratified cuboidal epithelial cells. The product is referred to as sebum. On the other side here, you'll notice that we also have a gland of cuboidal epithelial cells, and these cells would produce sweat. The product of sebaceous glands is referred to as sebum. Again, it contributes to the acid mantle. Together with sweat, we have an antibacterial side, or a surface that is unfavorable to unfavorable, possibly pathogenic organisms. So an acid mantle enables us to have a healthy skin. And healthy skin has an acidic nature, secretion on its surface. The sweat is produced from sudoriferous glands, which are called eccrine or merocrine or apocrine. You should know the difference between the three different terms and the two different types of sweat. Okay, your more true sweat is produced by your merocrine glands, while your more fatty, odor-rich sweat is apocrine, located in the armpit and genital regions. We've got other glands throughout the body that are also considered glands, but they're referred to as modified sweat glands. Other structures considered appendages of skin include hair and nails. And when it comes to hair, the terms on the screen are these terms you would worry most for potential test questions. Different hair has different color depending on the shade of melanin, or maybe the presence of iron molecules, or possible air within the hair. Other fancy terms for hair found throughout the body that you should know would be lanugo, villus, and terminal hairs. Fancy term for loss of hair is alopecia, and excessive hairiness due to endocrine disorders often would be hirsutism. If it's a male, it's normal for one to have body hair and facial hair. That would be due to sex hormone referred to as androgen. Testosterone is an androgen. The other last structure would be nails, which are modified keratin, which contributes to protecting the ends of your fingers and provides some dexterity. The anatomy of a nail is more FYI. Okay. Blood vessels and nerve supply within the skin are going to be more important to know for exam. Heat production is regulated through the nervous system. The nervous system controls the diameter of blood vessels, including your ability to sweat. You should know what normal body temperature is in Fahrenheit and in Celsius by referring to your notes and the textbook. Color in the skin. There are some terms that you should know clinically referred to as jaundice. You should understand the anatomy of a bruise, why it's different colors. Purple or dark blue would refer to a bruise that is fresh, versus your yellows and browns would be a bruise that's older, and the blood that is in the skin is breaking down, specifically a substance called bilirubin. Responsible for pigmentation, the primary pigment of skin color, is melanin. Two other substances that can contribute to color of skin is keratin and hemoglobin, and that would depend on the amount of skin pigment one has. The primary determinant of skin color, controlled by your genes, and the activity of your melanocytes is referred to as melanin. And you'll have an assigned reading to know the chemistry, composition, and purpose of melanin and where melanin is located in the skin. What determines the activity of melanocytes is genes and UV light exposure. Again, the primary factor determining skin color is your genes. Other terms that relate to changes in color of one individual would be erythema, cyanosis, blanching, and blushing.